Chapter 2. In the Ghadi's huge diwan, the distant chandeliers gave Khayyam an ivory hue. As he entered, two middle-aged guards pinned him by the shoulders as if he was a violent madman, and in this posture he waited by the door. Seated at the other end of the room, the Ghadi had not noticed him as he gave out a ruling on some affair and carried on a discussion with the plaintiffs, reasoning with the one and reprimanding the other. It seemed to be an old quarrel amongst neighbors, consisting of tired old gripes and pettifoggery. Abu Tahar ended by loudly showing his weariness, ordering the two heads of family to embrace there and then in front of him, as if they had never quarreled. One of the two took a step forward, but the other, a giant with a narrow forehead, objected. The Ghadi gave him a mighty slap on the face, at which the onlookers trembled. The giant cast a quick look at this chubby, angry, and frisky man who had to hoist himself up to reach him. Then he lowered his head, wiped his cheek, and complied. Having dismissed this group, Abu Tahar signaled to his militiamen to approach. They reeled off their report and replied to questions, having to explain how they had allowed such a crowd to gather in the streets. Then it was the turn of Scarface to give his explanation. He leaned toward the Ghadi, who seemed to have known him a long time, and started off in an animated monologue. Abu Tahar listened closely without revealing his own feelings. Then, having taken a few moments to think it over, he gave an order. "Tell the crowd to disperse. Let every man go home by the shortest route. And," addressing the attackers, "you all go home too. Nothing will be decided before tomorrow. The defendant will stay here overnight and will be guarded by my men and none other." Surprised by being asked so speedily to disappear, Scarface made a feeble protest, but then thought the better of it. He wisely picked up the tail of his rope and retreated with a bow. When he was alone with Umar, the only witness being his own confidant, Abu Tahar pronounced a mysterious phrase of welcome. "It is an honor to receive the famous Umar Khayyam of Nishapur." He revealed not the slightest hint of emotion. He was neither sarcastic nor warm. His tone was neutral, his voice flat. He was wearing a tulip-shaped turban and bushy eyebrows and a gray beard without mustache, and was giving Khayyam a long, piercing gaze. The welcome was the more puzzling since for an hour Umar had been standing there in tatters for all to see and laugh at. After several skillfully calculated moments of silence, Abu Tahar added, "Umar, you are not unknown in Samarkand. In spite of your tender years, your knowledge had already become legendary, and your talent are talked about in the schools. Is it not true that in Isfahan you read 7 times a weighty work by Ibn Sina, and that upon your return to Nishapur you reproduced it verbatim from memory?" Khayyam was flattered that this authentic exploit was known in Transaxania, but his worries had not yet been quelled. The reference to Avicenna from the mouth of a Ghadi of the Shafi rite was not reassuring, and besides he had not yet been invited to sit down. Abu Tahar continued, "It is not just your exploits which are passed from mouth to mouth, but some very curious quatrains have been attributed to you." The sentence was dispassionate. He was not accusing, but he was hardly acquitting him. Rather, he was only questioning him indirectly. Umar ventured to break the silence. "The Rubai, which Scarface quoted, was not one of mine." The Ghadi dismissed the protest with a gesture of impatience, and for the first time his voice took on a severe tone. "It matters little whether you have written this or that verse. I have had reports of verses of such profanity that I would feel as guilty quoting them as the man who spread them about. I am not trying to inflict any punishment upon you. These accusations of alchemy cannot just go in one ear and out the other. We are alone. We are two men of erudition, and I simply wish to know the truth." Umar was not at all reassured. He sensed a trap and hesitated to reply. He could see himself being handed over to the executioner for maiming, emasculation, or crucifixion. Abu Tahar raised his voice and almost shouted, "Umar, son of Ibrahim, tent maker from Nishapur, can you not recognize a friend?" The tone of sincerity in this phrase stunned Khayyam. Recognize a friend? He gave serious thought to the subject, contemplated the Ghadi's face, noted the way he was grinning and how his beard quivered. Slowly, he let himself be won over. His features loosened and relaxed. He disengaged himself from his guards who, upon a sign from the Ghadi, stopped restraining him. Then he sat down without having been invited. The Ghadi smiled in a friendly manner, but took up his questioning without respite. "Are you the infidel some people claim you to be?" It was more than a question. It was a cry of distress that Umar did not overlook. "I despise the zeal of the devout, but I have never said that the one was too." "Have you ever thought so?" "Never, as God is my witness." "As far as I am concerned, that suffices, and I believe it will for the Creator also, but not for the masses. They watch your words, your smallest gestures, mine too, as well as those of princes. You have been heard to say, 'I sometimes go to mosque where the shade is good for snooze.' Only a man at peace with his Creator could find sleep in a place of worship." In spite of the Ghadi's doubting scowl, Umar became impassioned and continued, "I am not one of those for whom faith is simply fear of judgment. How do I pray? I study a rose, I count the stars, I marvel at the beauty of creation and how perfectly ordered it is, at man, the most beautiful work of the Creator, his brain thirsting for knowledge, his heart for love, and his senses, all his senses alert or gratified." The Ghadi stood up with a thoughtful look in his eyes and went over to sit next to Khayyam, placing a paternal hand on his shoulder. The guards exchanged dumbfounded glances. "Listen, my young friend. The Almighty has granted you the most valuable thing that a son of Adam can have: intelligence, eloquence, health, beauty, the desire for knowledge and a lust for life, the admiration of men, and I suspect the sighs of women. I hope that He has not deprived you of the wisdom of silence, without which all of the foregoing can neither be appreciated nor preserved." "Do I have to wait until I am an old man in order to express what I think?" "Before you can express everything you think, your children's grandchildren will be old. We live in the age of secret and of fear. You must have two faces. Show one to the crowd and keep the other for yourself and your Creator. If you want to keep your eyes, your ears, and your tongue, forget that you have them." The Ghadi suddenly fell silent, but not to let Umar speak, rather to give greater effect to his admonition. Umar kept his gaze down and waited for the Ghadi to pluck more thoughts from his head. Abu Tahar, however, took a deep breath and gave a crisp order to his men to leave. As soon as they had shut the door behind them, he made his way towards a corner of the diwan, lifted up a piece of tapestry, and opened a damask box. He took out a book which he offered to Umar with a formality softened by a paternal smile. That book was the very one which I, Benjamin O. Lesage, would one day hold in my own hands. I suppose it felt just the same with its rough, thick leather with markings which looked like a peacock tail and the edges of its pages irregular and frayed. When Khayyam opened it on that unforgettable summer night, he could see only 256 blank pages, which were not yet covered with poems, pictures, margin commentaries, or illuminations. To disguise his emotion, Abu Tahar spoke with the tones of a salesman. It's made of Chinese kaghez, the best paper ever produced by the workshops of Samarkand. A Jew from the Maturid district made it made it to order according to ancient recipe. It is made entirely from mulberry. Feel it. It has the same qualities as silk. He cleared his throat before going on. I had a brother, 10 years older than I. He died when he was as old as you. He had been banished to the Balk for having written a poem which displeased the ruler of the time. He was accused of fomenting heresy. I don't know if that was true, but I resent my brother for having wasted his life on a poem, a miserable poem hardly longer than a rubai. His voice shook and he went on breathlessly. Keep this book. Whenever a verse takes shape in your mind or is on the tip of your tongue, just hold it back. Write it down on these sheets which will stay hidden, and as you write, think of Abu Tahar. Did the Ghadi know that with that gesture and those words he was given birth to one of the best kept secrets in the history of literature, and that the world would have to wait 8 centuries to discover the sublime poetry of Umar Khayyam, for the Rubaiyat to be revered as one of the most original works of all time, even before the strange fate of the Samarkand manuscript was known? Chapter 3. That night, Umar tried in vain to catch some sleep in a belvedere, a wooden pavilion on a bare hillock in the middle of Abu Tahar's huge garden. Near him on a low table lay a quill, an inkpot, an unlit lamp, and his book, open at the first page which was still blank. At first light there was an apparition. A beautiful slave girl brought him a plate of sliced melon, a new outfit, and a winding scarf of Zandan silk for his turban. She whispered a message to him. The master will wait you after the morning prayer. The room was already packed with plaintiffs, beggars, courtiers, friends and visitors of all sorts, and amongst them was Scarface, who had doubtless come for news. As soon as Umar stepped through the door, the Ghadi's voice stirred everyone's gaze and comment to him. Welcome to Imam Umar Khayyam, the man without equal in knowledge of the traditions of the Prophet, a reference that none can contest, a voice that none can contradict. One after another, the visitors arose, bowed, and muttered a phrase before sitting down again. Out of the corner of his eye, Umar watched Scarface, who seemed very subdued in his corner, but still had a timid smirk on his face. In the most formal manner, Abu Tahar bid Umar take his place at his right, making a great show of dismissing those near him. He then continued, Our eminent visitor had a mishap yesterday evening. This man who is honored in Khorasan, Fars and Mazandaran, this man whom every city wishes to receive within its walls and whom every prince hopes to attract to his court, this man was molested yesterday in the streets of Samarkand. Expressions of shock could be heard, followed by a commotion which the Ghadi allowed to grow a little before signaling for quiet and continuing. Worse still, there was almost a riot in the bazaar. A riot on the eve of the visit of our revered sovereign, Nasr Khan, the son of royalty, who is to arrive this very morning from Bukhara, God willing. I dare not imagine what distress we would be in today if the crowd had not been contained and dispersed. I tell you that heads will not be resting easy on shoulders. He stopped to get his breath, to drive his point home and let fear work its way into the audience's hearts. Happily, one of my old students, who was with us here, recognized our eminent visitor and came to warn me. He pointed a finger towards Scarface and invited him to rise. How did you recognize Imam Umar? He muttered a few syllables in answer. Louder! Our old uncle here cannot hear you, shouted the Ghadi, indicating an ancient man with a white beard to his left. I recognized the eminent visitor by his eloquence. Scarface could hardly get the words out, and I asked him who he was before bringing him to our Ghadi. You did well. Had the riot continued, there might have been blood shed. You deserve to come and sit next to our guest. As Scarface was approaching with an air of false submission, Abu Tahar whispered in Umar's ear, He may not be your friend, but he will not dare to lay into you in public. He continued in a loud voice, Can I hope that in spite of everything that he has been through, Khawaja Umar will not have too bad a memory of Samarkand? I have already forgotten whatever happened yesterday evening, replied Khayyam. In the future, when I think of this city, a completely different image will spring to mind, the image of a wonderful man. I am not speaking of Abu Tahar. The highest praise one can give to a Ghadi is not to extol his qualities, but the honesty of those for whom he has responsibility. As it happens, on the day I arrived, my mule had struggled up the last slope leading to Kish Gate, and I myself had hardly put my feet on the ground when a man accosted me. Welcome to this town, he said. Do you have family or friends here? I replied that I did not without stopping, fearing that he might be some sort of crook or at the very least a beggar or irksome. But the man went on. Do not be mistrustful of my insistence, noble visitor. It is my master who has ordered me to wait here and offer his hospitality to all travelers who turn up. The man seemed to be of a modest background, but he was dressed in clean clothes and not unaware of the manners of respectable people. I followed him. A few steps on, he had me enter a heavy door, and I crossed a vaulted corridor to find myself in the courtyard of the caravanserai, with a well in the center and men and animals bustling all about. Around the edges, on 2 floors, there were rooms for travelers. The man said, You can stay here as long as you wish. Be it one night or the whole season, you will find a bed and food and fodder for your mule. When I asked him how much I had to pay, he was offended. You are my master's guest. Tell me where my generous host is so that I can address my thanks to him. My master died 7 years ago, leaving me a sum of money which I must spend to honor visitors to Samarkand. What was your master's name so that I can tell of his acts of kindness? You should give thanks to the Almighty alone. He knows whose acts of kindness are being carried out in his name. This is how it came about that I stayed with this man for several days. I went out and about, and whenever I came back, I found plates piled high with delicious dishes, and my horse was better cared for than if I myself had been looking after him. Umar glanced at his audience, looking for some reaction, but his story had not caused any looks of surprise or mystery. The Ghadi, guessing Umar's confusion, explained, Many cities like to think that they are the most hospitable in all the lands of Islam, but only the inhabitants of Samarkand deserve the credit. As far as I know, no traveler has ever had to pay for his lodgings or food. I know whole families who have been ruined honoring visitors or the needy, but you will never hear them boast of it. The fountains you have seen on every street corner, filled with sweet water to slake the thirst of passers-by, of which there are more than 2,000 in this city made of tile, copper, or porcelain, have all been provided by the people of Samarkand. But do you think that a single man has had his name inscribed on one to garner gratitude? I must confess that have nowhere met such generosity. Would you allow me to pose a question which has been bothering me? The Ghadi took the words out of his mouth. I know what you're going to ask. How can people who so esteem the virtues of hospitality be capable of violence against a visitor such as yourself? Or against a poor old man like Jabr the Lanky? The answer I am going to give you is summed up in one word: fear. All violence here is born of fear. Our faith is being attacked from all sides by the Qaramatians in Bahrain, the Imamis of Qom, the 72 sects, the Rum in Constantinople, infidels of all denominations, and above all the Ismailis in Egypt, who have a massive following right in the heart of Baghdad, and even here in Samarkand. Never forget that our cities of Islam, Mecca, Medina, Isfahan, Baghdad, Damascus, Bukhara, Marwa, Cairo, Samarkand, are no more than oases that will revert to being desert if neglected for a moment. They are constantly at the mercy of a sandstorm. Through a window to his left, the Ghadi expertly calculated the sun's passage. He stood up. It is time to go and meet our sovereign, he said. He clapped his hands. Bring us some fortification for the journey. It was his practice to supply himself with raisins to munch on his way, a practice much imitated by those around him and those who came to visit him. Hence the immense copper platter which was brought in to him, piled high with a mound of these pale treats for everyone to stuff their pockets. When it was Scarface's turn, he grabbed a small handful which he held out to Khayyam with the words, I suppose that you would prefer me to offer these to you as wine? He did not speak in a very loud voice, but as if by magic everyone present fell silent. They stood with the bated breath, watching Omar's lips. He spoke. When one wishes to drink wine, one chooses carefully one's cup-bearer and drinking companion. Scarface's voice rose a little. For my part, I would not touch a drop. I am hoping for a place in paradise. You do not seem anxious to join me there. The whole of eternity in the company of Sentatia's ulama? No, thank you. God promised us something else. The exchange stopped there. Omar hurried to join the Ghadi who was calling him. The townspeople must see you ride next to me. That will dispel their impressions of yesterday evening. In the crowd gathered around the residence, Omar thought he could make out the almond seller concealed in the shadow of a pear tree. He slowed down and looked around for her, but Abu Tahar badgered him. Faster! Woe betide you should the Khan arrive before us.